Good morning, dear guests. My name is Uliana Chromyak, and I am the Executive Director of Ukraine House Davos. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to welcome all of you today. This is the fourth day of our work, and we will start with a panel discussion, Saving Ukrainians Saves Ukraine, Human Capital in War and in a War Economy. Before we launch the panel, let's review the video.
Where schools and homes once stood, just shelled-out buildings remain.
This is what Russia calls liberation.
Russian bombs have ripped through these buildings in central Kharkiv.
Now, Ukraine is thought to have the highest density of landmines of any country on Earth.
This accounts for 30% of Ukraine's total land area, roughly the size of Florida.
15,000 men and women lost limbs in the first half of this year alone.
Russia set off a humanitarian catastrophe that has rippled around the world.
More than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians.
Emergency medical supplies are on the way to Ukraine from Santa Barbara County thanks to direct relief.
A group in Colorado is preparing to send medical supplies.
Around $4.1 billion to support Ukraine's overall economic, social and financial resilience.
The European Union has, as you know, supported Ukraine financially this year with 19.7 billion euros.
We are helping people to stay safe, to stay warm and to live in a dignified situation.
Our evacuation, but we've been delivering food packets today and some stoves.
And what could be more natural than this?
50 kilometers north of here, life is returning. And sometimes in spite of terrible destruction that there just aren't the means yet to begin to rebuild.
National and international organizations like Britain's Halo Trust are on site, trying to clear and defuse the mines.
No longer on the battlefield, but still a fighter.
The flash and bang of the explosions disturbing the morning call of the birds.
Let's be clear. Russia is causing Ukraine's destruction, and Russia will eventually bear the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction.
And it is my great pleasure to invite to the stage the moderator of the panel, Katya Soldak, Editorial Director of Forbes Media's International Editions. Have a great discussion.
Everyone, good morning. It's great to see everyone here. It's great to know that at the fourth day of the panels and discussions, we still have a room full of people. The conversation is not over. And this discussion is going to be about Ukrainian people. It's titled Saving Ukrainians Saves Ukraine, Human Capital in War and in War Economy. But before we get into the technicalities of human capital in this discussion, I just want to give a shout out to Ukrainian people, because human capital is people. And I just want to give a shout out to brave Ukrainians who show and demonstrate grit and persistence and resilience and try to achieve this victory. We have a great cast of panelists today. I would like to invite on stage Taras KACHKA, Deputy Minister, Trade Representative, Ministry of Economy of Ukraine, Ukraine Human Capital Program. Please welcome Taras. Also, we have KALJULAID, President of Estonia, who you all know very well. We have Professor from Oxford, Alexander Betts, Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs. Please welcome him. And we have SVITLANA, GRYTSENKO, Member of the Board, Viktor PINCHUK Foundation, who also leads the Recovery Project. Welcome, SVITLANA. I would like to start this conversation with Taras, because we would like to hear from somebody who represents Ukrainian government. How does the government treat human capital in Ukraine? What is the situation? How does it work during the war? And anything specific to what's happening now?
Thank you for giving this opportunity for us to explain what government is doing for last 2 years. And I think that, first of all, I would like to highlight that human capital is so interesting topic that you can just direct your response to whatever dimension you want. Yeah, so you can talk about schools, about public health, about security, housing, etc. But I think that here the most interesting element of human capital policy is, of course, displaced persons, internally displaced persons, people who live, who went abroad for protection, and how it works. I think that the first and foremost that Ukrainian government, thanks to support of our partners, has an opportunity to support as well people who are in needs, and in particular internally displaced persons. And we have a lot of support from World Bank, from government of Japan, particularly on the internally displaced persons, as well as from Germany and other partners. And of course, now after 2 years of war, the question on internally displaced persons, that we need to provide people an opportunity not only to maintain decent life, so not only to support them financially for having an opportunity to live in decency, but as well the opportunity to decide on how to settle their life, whether to settle at the place where they live now or to come back if the territory where they lived is liberated. And here first of all, this is a question of security. So that was especially for people who want to come back to their homes. And I think that this is as well, after all, a matter of war and a matter of protection of cities by air defense, because even today, during breakfast, there were a lot of sirens here because people with their mobile phones, they just heard that around the nation there was an air alert. So this is the security element, but then the next big thing is, of course, housing, because a lot of people lost their apartments or their houses as a result of bombardment, or if the person wants to settle at a new place, this is a case of purchasing new apartment. Yeah, so because after all, as any European state, Ukraine is a nation of people who, let's say, put the real estate in the center of their private economy. Yeah, so it's the case in the UK, in Germany, everywhere. So it's that's why we have the program. It's called EOSELA, so they're on affordable mortgage, and this is quite interesting element because this is a long-term mortgage with very reduced interest rate, where government compensates interest rate. The goal of this is just to reactivate construction business, so just to construct more apartments, but also to engage people in investment, long-term investments in their private life, just to be settled in certain area. So this is the cornerstone of all these things. And the next big thing is, of course, employment, and employment on local level. And that's why we need not only big investment projects with tens of thousands of employees. Of course, we want them because they help to increase GDP drastically. But what is more important is a big number of small businesses on local level, also for people just to have control on their lives. So that's why we provide grants, micro grants for small business, for micro business. So it's up to 250,000 hryvnias, so it's like $6,000. Yeah, so that's why. And this is quite popular. We have more than 10,000 grants issued last year, and we have plenty of really good stories in different regions that people, IDPs or people in heavily destroyed cities and municipalities. They open their small businesses. Usually it's HoReCa, yeah. So, but a part of small bakeries and cafeterias, there are different small productions of different handmade things, etc., etc. So it's usually like 2, 3, 5 people working, but it's also like provides a lot of inspiration for other people, because if a lot of people have savings, and if you can go and take grants, and someone take grants and open business, maybe I can use my small savings to open business as well. So we want to revive life on local level in municipalities, because it brings life in community, and community attracts people also to come back from abroad. And this is the maybe last element of my very like non-systematic speech, because there are a lot of small elements, and then if you take all elements of our policy, it will become boring speech. But on people living abroad, I think that for all of us, this problem is multidimensional, because this is a security problem, because people just...
You're talking about people who left as
refugees. Who left Ukraine, so that because they left due to security reasons. But as well, before this massive aggression, large-scale aggression, Ukraine was a source of economic emigration from Ukraine to Poland, to Czech Republic, to Germany, and it's quite interesting because in comparison with Poland, when Poland acceded to the European Union, all member states were opposing Poles to become a part of free movement of persons. So only UK was brave to open labor market for Poland. Germany blocked every. In Ukraine, it's otherwise. Before providing us membership perspective, Poland, Germany, Czech Republic opened their market for Ukrainians. So that's why for us, this economic part of emigration, of Ukrainians living abroad, is extremely important, because we know that we want them back to Ukraine. We want to provide them an opportunity to come back to their, because after all, we want to live where we want to live, yeah? So this comfort of choice of place to live. But we know that there is a competition, because we know that for Poland and for Germany and for Czech Republic particularly, the employment market is a core element for structural reforms, for further growth of their GDP. So they cannot grow without attracting people. So that's why there will be a competition for Ukrainians between Germany and Ukraine. And first of all, I think that what is good is that in reality, our partners, they support Ukrainians. They help them to integrate in societies where they live, but at the same time they do not manipulate with the fact that they don't want them to come back to Ukraine. So in our dialogue with our partners, and we started this dialogue, we see the willingness to have like common policy or cooperation targeted on helping people to turn back to Ukraine. So we can say that Ukrainian government and German government can help a person to come back from Germany to Ukraine, because we can provide some kind of support in terms of infrastructure, apartments, workplaces, etc. And Germany can maybe streamline part of social protection they provide to Ukrainian refugees to help them financially to relocate back to Ukraine. I think that it will work if it will start in this year, next year, and now we are in early talks with our partners on these programs. But later it will be very equal competition. And the only thing that will definitely, so that's why we need to care, we want to care about Ukrainians, but I think that in reality it will be a question of employment, a question of providing people with quality jobs, with companies, factories, etc. in Ukraine. So we will end in economic policy and attraction of investments as well. And in my opinion, this is maybe Ukrainian story of refugees is the most positive story, because what we see is that despite the migration crisis in the EU, Ukrainians are not treated as a part of this migration crisis. So that there is like understanding that it is rather closer to free movement of people than to migration or refugee problem. And this is really optimistic news for all of us. Thank you.
This is very interesting, and I think we will elaborate a little bit more on how to bring people back to Ukraine after we talk for a little bit. But I can tell that being from the United States, we have a lot of immigrants from, refugees from Ukraine who came by programs U4U and temporary protected person status. And I hear nothing but good comments from people who work with Ukrainians because of their work ethics, because of their stamina and skills as well. Now I would like to turn to Alex, who can tell us a little bit more broadly about refugees and what happens, what are the stories, and maybe give us some examples of the countries who already dealt with similar issues.
Thank you very much, Katia. First of all, it's a real honor to be part of this conversation. I'm a professor of forced migration and international affairs at the University of Oxford, and I work mainly in my research on the economic lives and contributions of refugees. One of the themes I'm particularly interested in is the relationship between how we treat people who are in exile as refugees and their ability to contribute to the post-conflict reconstruction and development of the countries they come from. I don't work on that specifically in relation to Ukraine, but there's hopefully some application from what I've learned in other parts of the world and historical contexts for the Ukrainian context. I should also add, I come from a university, the University of Oxford, that's deeply committed to supporting the human capital of Ukrainians. In the aftermath of February 2022, we created a graduate scholarship program for Ukrainians, and in very short turnaround, we were able to have that in place for students arriving in October 2022. Colleges across the university came together, and we've managed to have over 50 Ukrainians come to Oxford as graduate students. One of the things they tell me consistently is that they want to take that opportunity that they're getting in Oxford and use it in the service of the future of Ukraine, to be part of the rebuild and the redevelopment of the country. And that's somewhere where my organization is hopefully making a very small but important contribution. There are three things I'd like to briefly cover. Some basic trends about where we are at the moment with Ukrainian refugees across Europe and what the dynamics of return look like. Secondly, what we know about the relationship between how we nurture and incubate human capital in exile and what that means for the long-term trajectory of countries affected by conflict. And thirdly, what we can learn from some historical examples, for instance, the Balkans and elsewhere, of what return looks like over time and what implications that has. So in terms of trends, as you'll all know, there are still some 6 million Ukrainians across Europe. Another 400,000 in other parts of the world, notably North America. Over time, there's been some element of return. Of the 18 million Ukrainians who left at some point, around 9.9 million have gone back. Over 30% of Ukrainians in Europe have gone back at some point to make a visit to Ukraine. So those dynamics, not only of return, but also of circulation, are at play. What we see in Europe is that the largest numbers of Ukrainians are in Germany and Poland, each of which host more than 1 million. But equally, the neighboring countries are hosting significant numbers, and the UK, the Netherlands, and Spain as well. Many of those countries across Europe have faced a real dilemma in how to integrate Ukrainians and ensure that they can access labour markets, educational opportunities, and public services. But I think in contrast to many other refugee populations, Europe, the European Union, countries like the UK have done a relatively good job in opening up labour markets and educational opportunities in ways that make a difference. There's some element of profiling that's been done to look at the labour market profile of Ukrainians in Europe. It's a diverse picture. 79% of Ukrainians in Europe are women. Many people have come from an agricultural or construction background, but also we have very high-skilled Ukrainians across Europe, often whom have had to work in areas that they're massively overqualified for and have struggled to get a foothold in labour markets, partly because of the precarity of their ability to stay for the long term. There's a real dilemma that Ukraine faces as a national government. Whether and how far to support opportunities for Ukraine abroad to develop and incubate their human capital versus the obvious need to have Ukrainians return and be part of that post-conflict reconstruction and development agenda. It was very interesting to hear President Zelensky speak in December about needing to create incentives for return. recognizing that European countries can't just compel repatriation, but that incentives like business loans, access to mortgages, opportunities for dual citizenship might need to be on the table. So secondly, there's an important relationship, I think, and this is coming at it from a British and European perspective, in how we treat refugees in exile, the Ukrainian population abroad, and what that means for the long-term trajectory of a country. One of the contexts I previously worked on was the Syrian crisis, and Syrian refugees hosted in large numbers by Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Initially, they were denied the right to work in those neighboring countries, but a new idea came onto the agenda at that time, which was that by supporting business people from Syria to incubate their businesses in exile, to take businesses that operated in Syria and have them relocate to neighboring countries, they could be part of that incubation of the post-conflict reconstruction and development process. By creating work permits and incentivizing job opportunities, by involving business in that process, change could happen. So education and employment matter not only for individuals while they're abroad, but what happens in the long term. Now, one of the big challenges we have in Europe at the moment is how long countries enable Ukrainians to remain. Ukrainians in the European Union have temporary protection visas for the most part. And there's a ticking clock, if you like, and an uncertainty about to what extent those temporary protection visas will be renewed, to what extent other labour migration options and opportunities for circulation will be on the table. In my country, the UK, we've developed a scheme called Homes for Ukraine. And we're reaching the second year of that scheme. And it's a 3-year scheme where there's uncertainty about what will come next. The UK has around 300,000 Ukrainians. They've been invited into the homes of British people. It's been an extraordinary success story for creating solidarity. But many Ukrainians I speak to in the UK have a real dilemma of whether to stay or go back to the country, have been unable to enroll in degree programs as they finish high school or secondary school because of that uncertainty about whether they'll be able to remain. So my view is that we need to strike a balance. We need to ensure that for the around 50% of people we know would like to stay, at least for the short or medium term, there are options available to have labour migration access, to have opportunities for labour circulation, and to incubate their human capital, to ensure that we don't have a generation of Ukrainians that haven't accessed educational and training opportunities because they're elsewhere in Europe, and to ensure that the companies that are just starting to engage across Europe, in my countries, companies like NatWest, Amazon have come together around an initiative about incubating that human capital, but recognizing the need to return and rebuild. So how do we strike that balance? It's not only a dilemma for Ukraine, but many of the host countries in dialogue with Ukraine. Thirdly, I think it's important to look at what we know from other contexts. I think the Balkans provide a really interesting case study. Bosnia after 1992, Kosovo after 1999. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people dispersed across the European Union. They were supported to access educational opportunities and access the opportunity to develop their human capital. And the overwhelming majority ultimately returned. There were, of course, challenges to return. For Bosnians, minority return produced challenges. Access to property was a major issue. In Kosovo, one of the challenges has been that although the majority of the 900,000 who left went back, the economy hasn't supported the jobs that were required, and many high-skilled Kosovars have continued to work elsewhere in the European Union, albeit with remittance relationships and an ongoing important influence through the diaspora. As Ukraine becomes more integrated with the European Union economy over time, inevitably there will be labour market circulation. Basic economics tells us that labour will move to where it gets the greatest return in its relationship to capital, and people will seek the best opportunities. But of course that will be tempered by the regulatory environment, what visas are on the table, what opportunities are available, and also by the very real commitment that many Ukrainians in Europe feel to be part of that post-conflict reconstruction and development. From a European perspective, I think the hope is that there can be over time greater cohesion, economic integration, and that circulation will occur naturally. But for the present, there's a massive dilemma faced by the Ukrainian government and by the rest of Europe about how to strike the balance between supporting opportunity on an ongoing basis for Ukrainians elsewhere and what that means for post-conflict reconstruction and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That certainly gives us some insights on how other countries dealt with this. I would like to ask Madam President, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about specifically Ukrainian human capital, because you're the neighbor, you know the country, you have some similarities with Estonia. Let us know your thoughts on this.
Yes, first, I always hesitate to talk about human capital. I much prefer to talk about Ukrainian people, their education, their talents, their dreams, and never underestimate the nation which suddenly finds itself in the situation where they have plenty of good neighbors and partners who are richer than they are and with whom they can freely trade. This is something which must not be underestimated, and of course it can only be fully used if you have a really well-educated population. And whatever I may think of the Soviet Union, and most of you know what I think of the Soviet Union, but one thing which was pretty strong in the Soviet Union was STEM science. And the reason why STEM science was strong was not only because it was a war economy always, but the other reason is that no person with independent thinking and sane mind would study social sciences and economy in Soviet Union. Because of course, I mean, it was kind of Orwellian to go and study that. So in addition, you needed to turn into communist to make any career in those sciences. So proper people remained in STEM. And therefore, there is a long-standing tradition in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain that we are really, really well educated, particularly in the subjects which really are the basis of the 21st century economy. And it's not only theory, it's very much the practical thing. And I'm more thinking of the Ukrainians who actually got hired by Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, other companies on their terms, which means that no, they didn't migrate to our countries. Yes, we also had tens of thousands construction and field workers working in Estonia, but the educated Ukrainians worked in the tech hubs in Ukraine for companies elsewhere. And the same, by the way, applies for Belarus people. And when in Belarus it became impossible to be an independent thinker and free worker, these companies took their people out from that country, and similarly, many Ukrainians have been helped to remain in their job, working for companies of us, for example, and now they are then not in Ukraine, but they're adamant that they'll go back. We have, in Estonia, at one point, we had 5% of our population was Ukrainian refugees. And we have Ukrainian schools, we have Estonian schools, and we also have Russian school in Estonia. It is going to close down, so everybody who has their children in Russian school in Estonia, then, I mean, this is wrong choice. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ukrainian schools will remain, but Russian schools in Estonia will close. But anyway, we see that there are people who put their children to Ukrainian schools, supported also by Ukrainian e-learning opportunities and possibilities, because they're adamant they go back. Children say, we live in Estonia and we learn how you live here in Estonia, and then we go back in Ukraine, and what we liked here we will do there as well, and what we didn't like here we will do better. And this is fantastic to see. And also, indeed, you already mentioned there is an economic logic, and you mentioned Balkan nations, but I would rather mention Baltic nations. I mean, Baltic nation, basically a movement from being a post-Soviet country to being a fully fledged EU member state was quicker than for Balkan nations, which means that people, even if they left when the living standards started to cohere with the rest of the Europe, they very quickly started to come back. It was easy to come back, and now it was not like in the old times that when you jumped over the fence from Soviet Union, then you remained in the West forever. You came back, and the big reason why they came back, and it will be the same in Ukraine, is that Western European labor market is extremely rigid. I mean, you have to progress slowly through the labor market, in addition to the problem that you will probably work under your qualification. But also, it's so slow. I mean, in Estonia, when we regained independence, my first job was sales secretary. My next job, and it happened in a year, was CAO. And this will also be the opportunity of this kind of social mobility in Ukraine. And people, therefore, will be attracted to their own home market. There will be lots and lots of reconstruction money available, I'm quite sure, but the most important thing is that people actually see better opportunities in their own country. This happened in all Baltic states with rising living standards. People started to come back. And it's very positive that they are, as you said, mostly in Poland and Germany, because Estonia saw a quicker turnaround because they were in Finland, those who had gone away. About 10% of our workforce worked in Finland. But Latvians and Lithuanians who do not have a neighbor who speaks very similar language in addition, they went to Ireland and UK. And it took far longer for them to readapt and come back than those who stayed in the neighborhood. But Ukrainians are staying in the neighborhood. So when Ukraine also comes now closer to the European Union, becomes the member of the European Union, it's actually pointless to live elsewhere than in your own country, which will be one of the fastest, if not, I think, the fastest growing economy in the European Union after the war. So the cards are rightly stacked, but first things first, we need to win this war before all these wonderful things can happen. And as we know, then from macroeconomic viewpoint, we're not spending on this war considerable money, and no one has ever been able to win a war spending 0.1% of their GDP. So first we need to get this thing done, and then we can turn to the rest.
So this gives me actually a very good transition point to what's happening on Ukrainian soil, because the war is happening in Ukraine. Ukrainians are getting wounded, traumatized, and these are the people who are Ukrainian society who are going to be there to rebuild Ukraine, to help recovery. And Svetlana, I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about the project that you're working on, recovery project, and how to integrate people who went through this horrible time into society and workforce and anything else that your project deals with.
Thank you very much, Katya. Well, first of all, I want to start off that I'm really proud to be one of these components of Ukrainian human capital. I think during the last 2 years, Ukrainians really proved to be great workers. They can achieve great results. But this all doesn't mean that we don't need to meet the basic needs. We don't need to increase our qualification, that we don't need a place to live. And of course, working under the work conditions for each of us, for those who are the front lines or those who are in the civilian life, it's a challenge. For someone, it's a risk of life. For someone, it's mental health issues. For someone, it just lost opportunity. And for somebody, it's a need to leave the country. It's really hard. You can't imagine, and I even can't imagine how hard for our government can be in terms of planning of human capital, because you can't find the numbers. You don't even know the exact numbers of people in Ukrainian territory, because part of it is occupied. So there is no chance to make a really long-term planning. You don't know how many people were taken to Russia into captivity. You don't know how many children were taken from Ukraine. So saying all this, I'm just trying to explain that Ukraine now has two biggest challenges. One thing is planning the human capitals to win, to get the victory. You know, you need people for this. And another challenge is already to start thinking what to do after the victory. And another thing is to keep the economy going today. Myself, I would like to speak today more a bit about human capital, and I agree with Madam President. I prefer the word people, you know, who are people who are at war or close to the war, and those who are risking their everyday lives to protect the country. Last year, Victor and PINCHUK launched a project which is called Recovery, and this project focuses on building a chain of rehabilitation centers throughout Ukraine. And as of today, already 6,000 people passed the rehabilitation, and that's why, having an opportunity to head this project, I speak to people who were wounded every day. That's why, for me, this is not in terms of numbers, this is about concrete stories. And maybe I'd even like to share a few with you to explain the mood and how people who were wounded lost part of their health, lost lots of their close people, but still being motivated to move on, still being motivated to be a proud, effective Ukrainian citizen. For example, I want to speak about Dima. He was wounded in May 2022. He's a sniper. He was wounded in Lugansk region for 3 days. He had to find the way out himself because everybody, his battalion, thought he was dead, and he had to try the way. Unfortunately, due to this, he lost his hand. And of course, this complicated for him to be a sniper in future. Anyway, he went through a long process of rehabilitation, prosthetics, and he returned to army. At first, he was working, let's say this way, in a back office, so he couldn't go to the front line just because for the physical reasons. But just like 5 days ago, I saw his photos on Facebook with a gun, proud and happy that he managed with his one hand and another one, not really his, but prosthetics, come back to the thing he does the best. And he's back to protecting to Ukraine. I can tell you a story about a young lady. She was working as a doctor and she got wounded and she couldn't continue working on the front line. But she went for education, she went abroad, she got great education, and now she went to economic field and bringing and creating workplaces for people. So I'm saying all this, that Ukrainians are really motivated. Ukrainians want to go on. They are ready to work. They need, of course, help to rehabilitate. We have a huge challenge in terms of mental health, physical health, where our medical system, and none of the medical systems in the world will be ready for such an increasing number of wounded people. And Ukrainian system also was not ready. I think we're doing a great job and trying to save the people, but to save the people and to be there, the first thing we need to stop the war. Because while the war here in Ukraine, while we don't get the arms to protect the people, we'll be losing our people. Our human capital will be going down. And it will be harder and harder for us to protect the country and in the future to recover and to be one of the best places to visit for all of you to come to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. I would like to ask all panelists, just follow up on what you just said. To win this war, maybe it's more a rhetorical question, but I still would like to hear your opinions on this. What would be #1 priority? Human capital, people, money, or weapons? Who would like to start? Okay. Madam President, please.
Money and weapons are the same thing. I mean, there is no difference. And if you have money and weapons, you can let's say, if you want to use the horrible word of human capital, you can avoid the extremely rapid depreciation of your human capital. Basically, you can stay alive. And therefore, of course, there is nothing more important right now than money, which will then be transformed into the long-term contracts, which will then be transformed into the arms and weapons. And if somebody has difficulties in understanding it, I've understood many politicians have, because they say, no, it's not about money, it's because we have no production capacity. I mean, this is how things work. You put money out there, and I think we really need to make a pledge that, let's say, all Rammstein coalition countries will spend 0.5% of their GDP. Some are spending above, by the way, Norwegians, Estonians, and some others. So we have demonstrated it's doable. It doesn't ruin your economy. You may have to raise taxes. We had to raise taxes to do so. 2% of VAT, 2% of income tax rise in order to be able to keep supporting Ukraine. We are alive. Nobody's, burning cars on the streets of Tallinn. So basically, it can be done. It has to be done. And then this will morph into the long-term contracts. And it will be even good, not only for Ukraine, because if Russian regime doesn't change and you cannot buy beer for hryvnias in Moscow, which probably will not happen, then we need this production capacity to remain safe when Russians have been beaten out of Ukraine, because it's not the end of the story. The ball is back in our court, and we need to keep spending and producing. If NATO countries had kept their promise from 2014, when everybody claimed they have so waken up, we would have had more than 900 billion more worth of ammunition and weapons in our stockpile. The war would probably have been over. But because we are much better at speeches than budgets, we have this problem.
Anyone else would like to add? Taras, please.
Yeah, I think that just to continue this line, I think that in reality, you need to save life, and you need to have a defense. After all this, what we see now is that usually, like this big bulb in Davos is just following things, like with artificial intelligence, so that, and we can have a lot of jokes on this or serious discussion on this, but in reality, this is a hype topic, so that. But on defense and defense industry and technologies, this is something that only now, start to become serious thing, because indeed, that about 20 years ago, so when I was student, like almost completing my studies. There was a decision on the EU level to create EU military forces, like 50,000 troops, and they didn't exist now, so that this decision was never implemented. And there were a lot of talks about defense, strategy, security for these decades, and only now this topic becomes serious because it's getting to the core topics of EU policy, because usually it's like it was on very margins. Was not even EU de jure, it was like cooperation of member states within the EU, so that, and now it's going to the core of these things. So that's why even if weapon may be like very like on another pole from human capital, in reality these efforts of mobilizing things on technologies in military, it will like change our societies for decades, but it will bring more understanding that we are defended, we are secure, we can continue our life in the region, because I really like your thought that war in Ukraine impacts investments in all regions, yeah, so to the east of Berlin. So that's why I think that in order to be able to talk about human capital, you need to have defense treated properly with proper supply of weapon. On everything else, I think Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian society, the European Union, member states, and their societies are capable to manage all human capital things. This is what we have in common, is that we discuss, we like clash with each other about strategies, priorities, labor markets, school programs, etc., etc. But in reality, all these clashes are about the importance we give to the human capital issues. So that's why even if someone can say that Ukrainian education is not so good as in Europe, but we are trying to do our best. And the same with social protection, we are trying to do our best. And this is what is our common feature in human capital. So that's why we need to defend this feature here and now in order to develop our societies as we want them to be in future. Thank you.
Alex, please.
Countries obviously need security and prosperity. Security is obviously a precondition for sustainable, successful economies. Ukraine will win this war. It will be a long process. It's important that during that time, the human capital of the country is supported. One of the reasons I think that in some areas this isn't a trade-off necessarily is because I think the money that goes into supporting the war effort and the military effort comes from different sources than the human capital investment. So I think partly on the human capital side, particularly for Ukrainians in exile, it's not just government money, it's not NATO, it's the private sector, it's businesses. In contexts like the UK, for instance, there's a real benefit that we have from the presence of Ukrainians. As Svetlana, you said, they bring skills, talents, aspirations. They contribute to our economy and society while they're there before they can return home. And businesses across Europe need talent and need human capital. So the investment in human capital is not always in tension with the investment into the war effort, and that contribution and engagement with supporting through jobs and education and investment in the economy will need to be in parallel to the military effort.
Thank you.
If I may also comment on this, I absolutely agree. This is a parallel effort that have to be, but I just want also to give one more example. Here in the room, we have Olga, who is heading a neonatal center in Kherson. And their hospital is being bombed every single day, almost sometimes many times a day. And what she is saying, and I'm actually repeating her message, is basically that having all these children, prematurely born children in the hospital, whose numbers increase because women are in stress, you know, the number of prematurely born people increased in Ukraine. And she is saying, please don't give me humanitarian aid. Please provide weapons. because unless you stop the shells, nothing will help me to protect the children in my hospital. And I'm just saying that I'm trying to bring up the context from Ukraine. Of course, it should be parallel, and we cannot think only about war investment, and there's other things, but the urgency of the issue really sometimes brings me more to the thought that maybe weapons are more important.
Thank you. I feel like we just briefly touched upon this very complicated, very serious issue. I would like to open the floor for questions and comments to enhance the conversation. I see a gentleman right here in the third row. Yes? Can you comment or ask a question? We need a mic.
There's a mic.
Hi, Nick Bilgorsky. I represent Nova Ukraine, a charity out of Stanford. We already work on the people problem by providing medical aid and resettling refugees, providing grants to organizations in Ukraine. The population of Ukraine is unfortunately expected to become from 36 in the world to 46 in the world and decline significantly, and that's clear for all of us. But I look at it this way. It's an opportunity for organizations outside Ukraine. As a growing proportion of Ukrainians will choose to live outside Ukraine, we have a focus and a priority on connecting them to diaspora, connecting them with each other, making sure they keep their ties to Ukraine. They get engaged in helping Ukraine from wherever they are. And we'll continue to work on just that.
Thank you. I see a hand over there.
Hello, my name is Gleb Vyshlinsky, Center for Economic Strategy in Kyiv. I have a question to Taras KACHKA and to Madam President. Do you believe it is possible to have the temporary introduction of a free movement of people, like as one of the 4 freedoms of the European Union, in the same way as we have temporary introduction of free movement of goods for Ukraine now? So that to solve the issue of unpredictability for refugees that was mentioned, that stops them in getting like more qualifications, more education, and also like have this scenario that Baltic states have also possible in Ukraine with circular migration. Thank you.
First of all, I think that I need to advertise that Gleb works on human capital strategy as well. Yeah, so that's one of projects of Center of Economic Strategies. So that's why I think that he's better expert than me on human capital. Yeah. So, but on this, I think that this is, you know, that this is something where symbols means more than the substance, because in reality, what we have is actual free movement of people, because the regime of temporary protection provides you this opportunity. You can just work freely without any permits, without, so that you just like live as EU citizens for 3 years in Ukraine. So with all these elements. So it's de facto free movement of people. But I think that, so that's why on substance, it's easy to negotiate this thing with member states of the European Union or with the European Union. But once it will be decided, it will be something like tectonic change in relations between Ukraine and the European Union. And in my opinion, it is better to do this when we have, let's say, calmer situation with security, when it will be easier for people to understand that both Ukraine and member state where you live care enough, maybe not equally in terms of US dollars or euros paid by social benefits or other protections, but equally treat in terms of security, in terms of live opportunity and so on, and then to provide this free movement of persons, because otherwise it will mean that it is equal competitions and you are welcomed everywhere, in either to turn back or to stay in the member states. So that's why, in terms of substance, we already have, Ukrainian citizens already have these rights, but the mere decision could really be like something that can be a game changer in terms of clear indications for strategies for people, how to spend their life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the last enlargement of the European Union, the free movement of trade and goods actually happened far before the actual joining of the European Union. In the case of Ukraine, indeed, Taras is right. Right now we have the free movement of people who has also de facto happened. And I think our objective should rather be to make it permanent as soon as possible, rather than say it is temporary. And I think it's possible mainly for the reason of the lessons which were learned in 2004. I mean, having kind of a 30% more of far cheaper workforce on common European market affected labor costs and suppressed wages in UK, which opened its labor market, and in Germany and France, which didn't open its labor market, but forced their companies to invest into Eastern European countries. The outcome was exactly the same. So but Brits had Brexit. So it might be actually far more useful to learn this lesson and say, since so many millions of Ukrainians already anyway work and live in Europe, let's make this situation permanent even before they join the European Union. I don't think why should this not be achievable. And you know, the paradox, of course, is that if there is free movement, then people will move to Ukraine and back and from Ukraine far more liberally and freely. So I see all the arguments on this side. But right now and right today, we had last week the visit of President Zelensky in Estonia, asking Estonian government to stop maybe paying, let's say, unemployment support for Ukrainian males who are of the fighting age, or do something else to make sure that they feel compelled to go and really first fight for Ukraine. So right now, if there is any blockage of free movement of labor, and justly so, it's on Ukrainian border. So we are in a little bit complicated situation there. Our government doesn't see any point of doing anything as long as because there is this free movement. So people just leave Estonia. If we say you have to go back, they go to Germany and other places. But I think we need collectively somehow respond to this demand from Ukrainians in this sense, and this is indeed a temporary measure, and then we could have a permanent free movement of people. Why not?
We have one more question here in the front.
Thank you very much. We're actually now looking at what could be policy solutions for exactly not very much the spirit of return, but I think integration of Ukrainians, no matter where they are, into Ukraine recovery efforts. And I wanted to ask the question to Professor Brett about the role of private sector. What kind of apprenticeship, trainingships? You've mentioned NatWest, I think Pratt did also training for Ukrainians to upskill them. But how do we then connect this? Were there any examples in Ireland? I think there was something done with the Citibank. What can private sector do? Because there are shortages in Ukraine, there are people temporarily outside. Should there be like trans-border cooperation on this? If you have any examples, thank you.
I think one of the challenges is that government response and business engagement go hand in hand. And the signaling at the moment, because of this very big dilemma about whether the messaging should be everyone needs to go home or there's a balance and some people remain, means that businesses are cautious about investing or investing in training where the return on investment is long-term because they don't know whether people will be able to stay. So signaling and messaging around the temporary protection visas across the European Union, messaging in the UK around the future of Homes for Ukraine is very important for that business engagement, where lots of businesses are waiting to see what happens before investing any more in apprenticeships, long-term training. Apprenticeships in many places have a certain minimum duration. Often that minimum duration is 2 years in my country. And lots of businesses that would like to support apprenticeships for Ukrainians simply can't because the Homes for Ukraine visas expire at a certain point within that time frame. And so that collective action needs to be a dialogue that brings businesses together to share learning. And a lot of the big professional services companies, Boston Consulting Group, for instance, have played a role in providing evidence, information, and convening. But alongside that, government has an important role to play in setting the tone, being clear on the signalling and the messaging so that business can get behind it. There's no shortage of great examples of commitments to employment, commitments to apprenticeship, commitments to training, but there's a hesitancy because of this big dilemma. So I think really at the highest political level, there needs to be a consensus between Zelensky and the Ukrainian government on the one hand, the European Union and other host countries like the UK on the other, about what the balance is, what the toolkit of carrots and sticks is to encourage people to go back, but who can remain, who can circulate freely, under what conditions, and then business can work collectively to get behind that.
Thank you, everyone. Are we out of time, or do we have time for one more question? All right, one more question. Who's the lucky one? I can't make this decision.
So take two.
Okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Mariana Romuniak. I represent Foundation Ridni. We are working in Ukraine with orphans, so I have small remarks. I think if we are talking about human capital, first of all, we have to talk about Ukrainian children, because as you know, Russia deported thousands of Ukrainian children, and we have to talk about them, and we have to return them back. And our main goal and our main issue is to provide the best conditions for Ukrainian children. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's a question as
oh,
well.
Okay. Follow up.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, I'm Martin Duplantier. I'm a president of French Architecture Association, and I have a charity fund called Architects for Ukraine. And we help cities in Ukraine to redevelop and to bring a new image, a new attractive image for the future of the cities. We find it very difficult to actually have predictions on demography and on their ability to bring people back to Izium, for example, or to Zaporizhia. And I would like to ask Professor Betts if he can share some examples in history, for example, in the Balkans, of such cities that have been close to the front line or that are still experiencing some troubles. We know that in Bosnia it is still unstable. And to tell us a little bit more about that. Thank you.
So it sounds fascinating what you're doing. I think historically, before we even get to architecture, property is a massive challenge when it comes to return. A lot of people who leave have obviously very damaged, destroyed homes, or are involved in contesting property rights and ownership. In the east of Ukraine, that's going to be a real challenge. What do you return to? What's happened to your home? We know those were major issues in the Balkans, for instance, and there are a set of guidelines from the international community around the relationship between return and, for instance, access to property, the Pinheiro principles. And it's very important that we think about property rights, ownership, land, housing, what justice looks like. And there's sometimes a tension that happens between people who have stayed in situ, who are seen as having struggled for the country and remained and contributed to the war effort, and those who return, who are sometimes seen as having been absent or in exile, and return and want access to the property they've left, or want a home to be rebuilt in the neighborhood that they were part of. And those have been particularly challenging things in repatriation efforts around the world, in the Balkans, but also very significant repatriations that took place in the 1990s. That question of property, rebuilding houses, architecture, very important, and often a source of social and political tension, where again, government involvement, but also the rule of law is very important to navigate some of those tensions.
I just wanted to add that it's not only war. Ukraine is also going through a rather radical economic structural change, and this is very similar to what we had. There were, in the old times, big cities concentrated around a few enterprises. Most of them had still quite good business relations and were trading mostly towards Russian demand. This is now gone, and these kind of towns on steroids will never get back to be as big. And the better we can recognize, I mean, which kind of economic activity is now in this new European economic structure non-viable, the better, because otherwise you risk to have a lot of lost investment in doing the reparation works. If this particular factory was only geared towards trading with Russia, I mean, it will not be there. And then you either need to, I mean, accept that population will be radically smaller. It's very tough, by the way, for these towns. We can see it. I mean, it's similar to, let's say, some German towns, but we see in Estonia that the self-esteem of people who remain in these structurally, economically altered situations, it remains for decades very low. So indeed, it will be a big problem.
Just to complete, I think that sorry. that you see that the two comments from audience that they were once again from extremes of human capital story. So it's really extremely huge in terms of elements, and it's a pity that we need to omit someone when you debate in 1 hour and a half debate. So that's why I think that the fact that we are putting human capital into our, let's say, core economic policy, also that very bold political statement that we do want care about our children, whether orphans forced to leave to Russia or having less access to Ukrainian education or education at home. So because my children in Ukraine, they suffer because school cannot find a teacher for physics, for example, because there is no, so people are, so men are in army, women are abroad, so that's why the teachers is also scarcity. But your question is very important because Ukraine decentralized itself in last 7 years or even 10 years. And it was a really successful move in development of Ukrainian society just to tackle this structural problem, because we cannot just stick to this planned economy where we maintain big industrial cities. We want these 1,440 communities to decide on themselves. And we met with mayors and let's say, so leaders of these municipalities and communities, and they have the same question, because they say, I want to calculate my budget, I want to understand whether I need big school, small school, whether I need hospital, I don't need hospital, whether I will be able to attract a company that will build small factory here or not. Everyone is guessing, and there is bad news, there is no answer. Good news that everyone is thinking about this. So that's why I think that dynamics here is what is really important, because I think that this is the difference between Western Balkans. I don't know good Western Balkans. But in our case, you see that for these 2 years, we definitely see that the war is not over, so that the front, so that we have a lot of talks about weapon support and security and defense support from our partners. So war is really in very hot phase, it's very tough. But we are in dynamic of thinking about how our future small and big cities will look like and how people will live there. And this is what is most important about human capital, because it's all about dynamics, how people live their life from childhood to retirement. Thank you.
And thus we'll conclude our session, and I'm sure this conversation will continue elsewhere because we just barely touched upon this subject. Thank you very much, our panelists. Thank you for your comments and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a great discussion. In order to keep you warm in Davos, we have a small present for you from the Ukrainian designers. Stay warm and support Ukraine. Thank you. Next panel on economic resilience will start at 1 p.m. Please join us here in this hall. Thank you.